So I reached down my freezer earlier and I pulled out my dinner for tonight. I'm having pork chops, all right? Yes, it's in plastic. Don't judge me. I do use plastic in my freezer sometimes. No, it's not optimal, but that's not what I want to talk about. All right, what I want to talk about is pork in general. Because if you're anything like me, when I started a carnivore diet, I swore off pork. Because pork is considered a very, very filthy animal. I don't disagree with that at all. Because they do wallow in their own crap. But there are actually a lot of very legitimate reasons why you shouldn't consume pork. Because if you're sourcing your pork from certain places, it can be a very, lower quality meat. It's something you probably don't want to consume, all right? But if you're sourcing your pork from the right place, it can actually be a pretty nutritious part of your diet. And it could be something that you might want to include to add some variation to your diet. And adding variation to your diet can be an important thing because it keeps it sustainable. You know, it adds some variety in there. It keeps things interesting. And it just helps you stick to the diet. All right, so let's dive right into this topic about pork. All right, so to kick it off, let's start with Smithfield Foods. Okay, so if you're not familiar with Smithfield Foods, they're the largest pork producer on the planet. And they're the largest pork producer in the U.S. So if you don't know this, they're also owned by the Chinese. So if you like funding communists, I guess you can spend your money on Smithfield pork. But I personally don't like funding communists, and I'd rather see my hard-earned money go to my local population, my local producers and stuff like that. So I choose not to buy my pork from Smithfield Foods for those reasons. Now, Smithfield Foods is a massive corporation, and they have like 11 brands under them. And just to name a few, we've got Eckrich, Nathan's Famous, Farmer John, Farmland, Armour, and there's many, many others, which I'll link all this information in the description below so you can check that out. And another issue I have with Smithfield Foods is that they promote, by design, large-scale feeding operations. All right, so think like factory farms. That's what they promote. And that's what they essentially do. They're giant factory farms all over the U.S., and that's where the pork comes from. So the issues with that is that the animals in these large-scale feeding operations, in most cases, they never step foot outdoors. Their entire life is spent basically in a cage. And, you know, those conditions are absolutely terrible. It's very unethical. And not only that, but it also breeds disease. And because it breeds disease, you know, they have to rely on antibiotics, they have to rely on vaccines, pharmaceutical drugs, and a lot of other really bad stuff that you really don't want in your meat. So, you know, if you can get away from that kind of stuff, you don't have those problems. But Smithfield Foods, that's what they're all about. They're about profit. So they're going to pump out as many pigs as they can possibly pump out. That way they increase their profit and they can meet the demand because there is a lot of demand for pork. And there's a lot of demand for Smithfield products. So another issue with these animals being in very confined environments is it also stresses the animal. And that's one of the points I'm going to get to later on in this video, is the fact that pork is very low on the nutrition scale, and it's actually one of the more inflammatory meats because of the way the animals are raised and the stuff they're fed. So another problem with Smithfield Foods is that they've partnered with MBF Therapeutics, which basically creates DNA-based vaccines for pigs, and they're very adamant about using that on their pigs. So if you don't like your pigs being vaccinated with who knows what, and you don't like consuming that meat, you probably want to avoid Smithfield Foods. Smithfield has also been recently accused of using carbadox in their pigs, and carbadox is a drug that has been banned in many other countries because of its carcinogenic effects on human beings. So if you're eating pork that has been treated with carbadox, there's a chance of that meat being potentially carcinogenic, which is not a good thing, obviously. Another bad thing about Smithfield pork is that up until 2018, they were using ractopamine in their pork. All right, and ractopamine is a feed additive that they add to the food and they feed it to the pigs to increase growth. It's essentially like a growth hormone. But there's a really bad stuff associated with that, and it's now been banned in like 122 countries. And the reason they banned it is because it has the potential to cause cellular damage, and not only the kidneys of human beings, but also the cardiovascular system. So that is not a good thing. Now in 2018, Smithfield did claim that they're 100% ractopamine free now, but in 2020, they were also re-accused of still using it in their pork. And the bad thing about all this is that there's no labeling requirements for any of this stuff. So when you go to the grocery store and you pick out some pork, there is no requirement to tell you if that pork has been vaccinated if they've used, feed additives or growth hormones or antibiotics or any of that stuff on the pork. So the consumer is basically left in the dark on all this stuff. There's no transparency about what's in the meat whatsoever. So that's just Smithfield Foods. So let's talk about the commercial pork industry in general. All right. So it's pretty well known at this point that commercial pork, they use vaccines, pharmaceutical drugs, antibiotics, growth hormones, ractopamine, all this potentially really harmful stuff. They use it in the pork industry. And like I mentioned before, there's no transparency about what's in your pork. So the average consumer goes to the grocery store, they pick out the pork they want to buy, and they have no idea what that pig has been treated with. There's also no labeling requirements for the country of origin. Now, the amount of pork that's imported from foreign countries is a lot less than like beef and stuff like that. I think it's only like 1 or 2%. But again, you go in there, you buy your pork, you don't know if it came from this manufacturer, that manufacturer, the big four meat packers, unless it has like a Smithfield food stamp on there. You don't know exactly where it's coming from or how the animal was raised or what it's been treated with. And that's a really bad thing because a lot of the stuff that's in this pork could be potentially harmful for human health. And another terrible thing about the commercial pork industry is that in 2018, Merck partnered with Moderna to create a swine-based mRNA vaccine technology called Sequivity. Now, the problem with this vaccine technology is not just that it's mRNA and it's widely used across the commercial pork industry, but the fact that they are able to customize and create a brand new vaccine based off whatever strain they deem they want to create a vaccine for in as little as 8 weeks, okay? And there is no safety testing that is required for that vaccine to be rolled out and used on pigs. And really, they can come out with as many customized versions of this vaccine as they want within any given period of time. And that is a terrifying thing because when there's no safety data to back this stuff up, we have no idea what the ramifications are going to be on human health. Another very terrifying thing about the commercial pork industry is that in 2023, John Oatley was granted the green light from the FDA to start gene editing pigs using CRISPR technology. All right, so CRISPR technology is a technology where you essentially go in there and you can alter the pig's DNA. You can turn off and on certain genes to essentially make them whatever you want them to be. And what he's been playing around with is how to make pigs sterile, and he's been very successful at doing that. So he's been doing that so that they can't reproduce, and he's also been playing around with their genetics to turn on growth hormones so that they mature faster and they can mass produce more pigs. So why is that a terrifying thing? Well, again, it's because there's no safety data to back any of this stuff up. We have no idea what the health impacts will be of us consuming pork that has been genetically engineered to be sterile, or consuming pork that has been genetically engineered to have an abnormal growth rate. We have no idea what the impacts would be from consuming that kind of stuff. So that's just more of these scientists coming in there thinking they can play God because for some reason the animals that were put here for us are somehow not good enough. And they've got to, manipulate them and engineer them and genetically modify them to make them better. And as the common trend goes, there is no transparency on any of this stuff. So the average consumer goes in the grocery store and you have no idea if your pig's been genetically modified or not. One of the other major drawbacks that pork has compared to a lot of the other meats is that it's much higher in linoleic acid, all right? So AKA omega-6. And omega-6, it can be a pretty important part of the diet as long as you're consuming it in small amounts. But when you're consuming too much omega-6, it becomes very problematic. It can lead to things like inflammation, cardiovascular disease, metabolic dysfunction, autoimmune disorders, and even cancer. And one of the big reasons that pork is higher in linoleic acid is because of how the animals are raised and the stuff that they're being fed. The feed and stuff they feed these pigs is absolutely disgusting. For the most part, it's a diet of grains and grain byproducts. So you're talking things like corn, soy, wheat, and things like that. But, worse than just that is that these grains are, like I said, byproducts. So it's the stuff that we don't consume. And in a lot of cases, it's very, very low quality. And it's going to be full of mycotoxins and aflatoxins. It's going to be sprayed with pesticides and herbicides. It's going to be grown in nutrient-depleted soil that's doused in synthetic fertilizers. And it's going to be GMO. And then on top of that, the USDA also grants licenses to some of these large-scale feeding operations that allows them to feed their pigs food waste, aka human garbage. And that's literally what they call it. They call it garbage feeding, and that's the licenses that the USDA issues out. So when you factor in all these variables, everything from how the pigs are raised, their living conditions, the amount of stress they undergo, the food and stuff they consume, it makes sense that they're going to be higher in linoleic acid and omega-6 just because of all the things they're enduring and the food they're consuming. Another potential health concern with pork, and this applies to all pork products, I'm talking commercial all the way up to the highest quality pork you can possibly get, is parasites. All right, there's two types of parasites that's in pork that can be transferred to humans and dogs, and that is roundworms and tapeworms. The only way to mitigate your risk and get rid of this stuff from your meat is to either freeze it at 5 degrees Fahrenheit or below for 20 days or more, which is negative 15 degrees centigrade, or to thoroughly cook your meat to an internal temperature of 160 degrees Fahrenheit or 71 degrees centigrade. Salt curing, processing, microwaving, freeze drying, dehydrating, and smoking meat is not an effective way to kill parasites. So as you can see, pork has a lot of drawbacks, and it would be pretty easy to just swear off pork forever and say I'm never going to consume it again. But you know, the good thing about pork is that it's very versatile, it tastes good, and it's also very, very cheap. So if you do want to include pork in your diet, there are some things that you can do to make sure that you're getting access to the highest quality pork that you can possibly consume, and to ensure that you're mitigating the risk of potentially consuming pork that has been inundated or contaminated with all this really bad stuff we just talked about. So the most important thing to consider when you're thinking about adding pork to your diet is the source. You want to make sure that you're sourcing your pork from a local producer that you can trust. All right, so if you're looking for local producers in your area, I do have a farm map on my website. It's the largest animal-based directory on the web. There's over 7,200 listings on there. It's 100% free to use. So I'll put a link to that in the description below. Go to that farm map, see if you can find a local producer in your area. And there's a pretty good chance that you'll find a local producer in your area that can provide you with high quality pork that does not have all this bad stuff associated with it. And the good thing about sourcing your food locally is, number one, it gives you direct line of sight on where the animal's coming from. You can see exactly how it's raised, what goes into making the pork, how the pigs are fed, how they're treated, all this stuff. And then additionally, a lot of these farms will actually pledge that they don't use antibiotics, that they don't use vaccines, that they don't use growth hormones or pharmaceuticals, or that they don't use GMO feed. And as a matter of fact, there's a lot of producers out there that allow their pigs to free range. So the pigs can just go about their merry way, foraging and doing all the things that pigs do, consuming a natural diet. And that is very, very important for a lot of reasons, but most importantly for the nutritional value of the pork. Because when you have a pig that's eating a natural diet and not a diet that's full of grains and garbage, that's going to help to balance out the fat profile, and it's going to drive down omega-6 while elevating omega-3, which is very, very important from a health perspective. And that's going to give the meat a better nutritional profile overall. And if that's not enough incentive for you to buy local pork, another great benefit is that your hard-earned money stays in your local economy. It goes straight from your pocket directly into the pockets of the hardworking men and women in your local community. And that's an amazing thing because it keeps our money out of the hands of these large mega corporations and these foreign countries that quite frankly do not have our best interests in mind. So if you want to include pork in your diet, but you want to avoid all those crazy pitfalls of doing so, buying local is the only way to do it. So including some variation in your diet can be a great way to keep things interesting and to make the diet more sustainable. And when it comes to variation, pork is a great option, but it does come with some risks. Knowing and understanding the risks is very important, but knowing how to overcome them is paramount. So hopefully this gave you all the information you need to make an informed decision on whether pork is right for you, and if it is, how to consume it safely.